So welcome to the Marxist Education Project. Marxist Education Project is a platform for organizing presentations, reading groups, and discussions around Marx and Marxism. Today's meeting is part of a series we started on Socialist Register's 2021 Beyond Digital Capitalism, New Ways of Living. And today's today we will be discussing the article by Bryan Palmer called The Time of Our Lives, Reflections on Work and Capitalist Temporality. Bryan is an Emeritus Professor of History at Trent University, Ontario, Canada. He is also the author of Revolutionary Teamsters and Minneapolis Truckers' Strikes of 1934 and co-author of Toronto's Poor, A Rebellious History, amongst many other books on Marxism, history, and my own favorite, E.P. Thompson, Objections and Oppositions. They will be presenting for about half an hour to 40 minutes, and then we will move on to discussions and questions. With that, I'll leave the floor to Bryan.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, both Sam and Michael and the Marxist Education Project for organizing this. It's great to be here. And I want to thank all of you who've plugged in, pulled yourself away from the television commentary on the second coming of Donald Trump. And it seems fitting for me, maybe this is the first time I've spoken and to an audience like this since Leo Panitch died in December. So I thought I would just say a few words about Leo and personal kind of reminiscences and appreciations. You'll all know, of course, of Leo's many writings with Colin Lees on the Labor Party, with Sam Gindin on the American Empire, with Greg Albo and Steve Meyer and others on socialist renewal and imagination. Few of you might even know from Canada of an older book that he did with Don Schwartz, which was just an amazingly influential book in Canada on the state response to trade unionism, its assault on working class and collective bargaining entitlements. It was really an opening foray into neoliberalism's constraint of the organized working class. Beyond this writing and linked to it, of course, he's been a mainstay of the Socialist Register since the mid-1980s. And that has been and we're here today because of that annual publication. And it really, to sustain that project through the current period has been really an amazing labor. And I've known Leo for many, many years, and we've often had many arguments, many disagreements. But we've also, I think, lived within a common space on the left. And I think one thing that I appreciated most about Leo was his warmth and generosity and his really ability to handle disagreement and difference in a comradely way. And as well, for me, being an historian and writing most often in an historical vein, what Leo did was give me a space to write as a Marxist, addressing in the Socialist Register genre through broad essays, addressing issues of concern to socialists and Marxists, which, quite frankly, I've found fewer and fewer historians in Canada willing to entertain. A sad thing for me over the later course of my career as a Canadian historian was the extent to which I saw the discipline moving, in some senses, away from Marxism, away from socialist concerns, and into more and more areas that I found of less and less interest. And the Socialist Register became a place where I could write and still have an audience and still have a connection to comradely discussions and debates and exchanges. And I'll be forever grateful to Leo and to Greg for opening those kinds of doors. And I think that kind of sort of interest in historicizing problems was always at the forefront of what Leo was trying to do in some senses with a lot of his own writing, and also with the writing in the Socialist Project. And I think that fits in some senses with my own piece in the Register on capitalist temporality and the sort of issue of time and its development over time. I think when Leo and Greg first asked me to write a piece on this in an issue that focused on digitalization and new ways of living in the midst of sort of the capitalist restructuring that has been paramount over the last few decades. Leo said, well, you could write something on time and address E.P. Thompson, whom I knew something about, particularly Thompson's essay on time, work discipline, and industrial capitalism. I wondered whether I'd be able to do it, and at first I kind of balked at offering a ready answer that I would take on the project. I thought about it for a while and agreed, and I was actually very pleased that I did, for it gave me a chance to sort of look at things with some fresh eyes. But in some ways, I feel a bit like an imposter in this volume, since my own areas of expertise have almost nothing to do with the very contemporary transformations of labor processes and development of new work environments, et cetera, that Ursula Hughes and others have been addressing for some time. On the other hand, the essay that I did end up writing is in some sense a backdrop to all of these new developments, since you can never kind of totally extricate time, the use of time, who controls it, how it sort of impacts the particular aspects of human endeavor from new ways of working, new ways, new streams of exploitation for capital. Giving me a chance to plug into that was, I think, something again that I'm grateful for. I think a leading quote from my piece, which is embedded in it, is the quote from Marx in an 1865 discussion with the International Workingmen's Association, where he said very succinctly, "Time is the room of human development." So time is where humanity grows, changes, is transformed. And for historians of the working class, of course, the struggle over time is fundamental to the formation of labor movements and trade union consciousness, the development of workers' mobilizations from really the mid-19th century well into the mid-20th century. Short time movements, the 9-hour, 8-hour struggles are central, and you can't really understand, and I sort of write about this and give a brief synopsis, you can't really understand working class self-activity for much of the period from the 1860s into the 1940s without looking at time. It figures centrally in major moments of class confrontation, such as, for instance, the Haymarket struggle for the 8-hour day that was in some senses the major moment of class confrontation and state repression in the late 19th century in the United States. A French historian, Alain Corbin, I think, summarized this very nicely with the phrase that the struggle over shorter hours was really the daily, this is a quote, a daily arithmetic of the 19th century. Now, central to all of this really is the extent to which this struggle for the shorter workday framed the aspirations and nature of the workers' movement. And in some ways, the realization of the 8-hour day in the more advanced Fordist unionized sectors of the political economy by the 1840s signaled in some senses a termination mark of the upward rise of the labor movement. It coincides with Eric Hobsbawm's essay, The Forward March of Labor Halted, with which I would have many disagreements. But the point I'm kind of sort of zeroing in on is the extent to which by the mid 20th century, seeming successes around limiting the working day seem to have reached their endpoint. There were virtually no significant advances in the struggle to constrain the working day. Few here and there, but overall not many beyond the achievements that had been realized by the 1940s. And yet, and from that point on, with that sort of realization that the shorter workday had been achieved in some senses, or the legal limits had been placed on the working day, in some senses, automation, technological change, new developments in capital heralded for many commentators sort of new breakthroughs into post kind of period. Keynes had basically suggested this as early as 1930, when he prophesied that the working day a century later, by 2030, would be reduced to something like 15 hours a day. You see this in some of Andre Gorz's writings of the 1980s, where he was saying farewell to the working class and suggesting that really the struggle really would be around basically dealing with a working day that was increasingly orchestrated around leisure as much as the workings of exploitation. And the zenith of this period of sort of thinking that some limits had been reached both for capital and for labor was the 1960s, when Marx's writings on alienation first became known in a widespread kind of way, where in conventional mainstream sociology, the problem of the day was determined to be leisure, and where there was much talk about how time was going to be spent when it wasn't going to be structured around the kinds of struggles that workers for a century had mobilized about. You see by the 1960s, in some ways, a certain complacency about working time that in many ways, I think, could have been avoided had Marx been read more seriously. Because Marx's views of the struggle around the working day were always very two-sided. He did see absolutely clearly that, against the sort of pompous bourgeois proclamations of the inalienable rights of man, the working class was forced to put on the agenda their Magna Carta of a limit to the working day. He saw the struggles around shorter hours, and he developed this in Capital as really the workers' main protection against what he called the serpent of their exploitation. So he saw the centrality of the struggle for the shorter working day and putting a limits on the time that capital actually owned the working class within. But he also noted, and this is something that was, I think, very prescient and was not appreciated enough as in this whole drift towards a more sort of benign understanding that the workers had won the limit of the working day. Marx also saw more, very decisively that in each victory that was won by workers for a legal limit on the working day, there would be a counter made by capital to actually extend and generalize the sort of process of exploitation. So whether it was through intensification, through technological change and innovation, or whether it was through, other more draconian means, what Marx inevitably pushed back on was that there would be a counter to every mobilization successfully waged by the workers. So he understood, in some sense, in very clear ways, that the class struggle for shorter hours was a fundamental protection necessary to working class well-being, but also that the bourgeoisie would constantly fight back. And Marx did note very clearly, and I'm going to read here, that the shortening of the working day finds its at last a limit in the generalization of labor to appropriate labor during all 24 hours of the day. This is the inherent tendency of capitalist production. So for as much as Marx saw the struggle for the shorter working day as central to working class well-being, he also understood that under capitalism, this struggle would inevitably lead to more struggles precipitated by capital. And I think I'll come back to this. We see that now. As the shorter working day seemed to be won by an ascendant trade union movement over the course of a century, capital has carved back its purchase of time, its ownership of time, its control over time. And that is, of fundamental importance, I think, in many of the essays in the Register, showing just how this has come about. Thinking around this problem, this dialectic of the struggle over time and the way that under capitalism it is always going to be constrained and pulled back, I think, let me read E.P. Thompson's essay, which was published in 1967 on time, work discipline, and industrial capitalism, in really with some fresh eyes. I remain convinced that that's a very important essay and a contribution to Marxism in a way that most other readers of it have not, I think, called attention to. That is, a fundamental contribution of Marx was his discussion of the origins of capitalism in primitive accumulation. And primitive accumulation being that secret that really explained for Marx how capital took all of the contradictory and developmental aspects of economic life that had been sort of coming together and fusing in the sort of chaos of feudalism and precipitating human development in new and capitalistic directions. And what primitive accumulation was the way in which the producers were divorced from the means of production, and the recruitment structurally of a labor force, of a contingent of humanity dependent on wages entirely, at the mercies of exploitation. This was fundamental, and it in some senses was Marx's way of addressing what the classical political economists like Adam Smith and others had been seeing as a kind of invisible hand that somehow produced the common good. But no one had really addressed that process of primitive accumulation in terms of the not just the way in which the producers are divorced from the means of production, but the way in which their inner beings are sort of transformed to accept culturally, if you will, the disciplines of a new capitalist regime. So the inner understandings of time and the ways in which this new proletariat acclimatized to the time disciplines and work disciplines of capitalism were of fundamental importance. And I think that's a critical essay and a critical contribution of Thompson's, is to address that the making of workers, within this sort of vice grip of capital's understandings of time. the kind of creation of a new psyche, the way that the new disciplines, as he put it, sort of bit on the sort of lives, bodies, and minds of workers going through this transition. And I think that's a great strength of Thompson's essay. What struck me, however, upon reading it, that essay, some 40, 50 years after its publication, was the extent to which Thompson himself was captive of that last moment of buoyancy around time and its possibilities that was the 1960s. And you see this in the way that he cites some of Marxist writings on alienation and the economic and philosophic manuscripts. You see this in his sort of confrontation with mainstream sociology about leisure as a problem. And the way in which he, in some senses, I would say now, romanticized the notion of pre-capitalist working experience, where he basically took the position that the more that life and work were integrated, as he suggested they were in pre-capitalist economic formations, the more that life and work and nature were connected, as again he suggested they were in peasant subsistence productions, in the work of some of those who harvested either the land or the sea, the forests. This integration of life and work, Thompson saw as very positive. I think he underestimated, in some senses, the tyrannies of work in those pre-capitalist settings. And in some senses, the harsh taskmaster that nature could be. He underestimated the extent to which, for certain segments of the population, like women, the integration of life and work was not always, in the domestic sphere, a liberating experience. This is relevant, I think, because if we jump forward to the particular kinds of political economies that many are writing about in the new ways of living under digital capitalism, we see that in some senses, life and work are once again integrated. That is, many work sectors are now necessarily dependent upon people being structured into work environments, which are often their homes, that in fact do necessitate the sort of more symbiotic relations between life and work than were evident in the classic factory system that Thompson was addressing in terms of his transition to industrial capitalism, the work disciplines, the time disciplines that accompanied that. But many of these new work sectors are anything but liberatory or emancipatory. And what this speaks to is the extent to which capital has always been, as Marx suggested it would be, willing to and able to adapt to the new situations related to time, to appropriate time in new ways, and indeed to generalize and extend that control over time, not just to the working day and to the legal limits of the working day, but actually to the entire 24 hours that people have at their disposal. And of course, this comes up with, when people are required to work in the gigified economy, when they are under intense surveillance, where their working time, which can happen anytime, when their working time is able to be surveilled, and many of the essays, including that by Joan Sangster, but also by many others in the New Register, address this frontally. And we see in our current moment, which may be transformatory in ways that we cannot yet appreciate. We see this with the COVID-19 pandemic. it strikes me that that for all the talk about getting back to normal, we may never get back to a normal in the future in terms of understandings of working time. I think capital will come to appreciate the extent to which it does not need necessarily in many work sectors the infrastructure that it had. People working from home gives capital new emancipatory and liberatory extensions of its ability to exploit. Now, much of what is written by Ursula and others looks at the way this gives openings to workers to actually present new ways of struggle and new forms of resistance. But the challenges here are actually going to be monumental as well, because one of the great inhibitors of capital's control and in a thoroughgoing way over the working class that emerged out of Fordism was that Fordism and the advanced factory system did create in the large work settings collectivities of working class experience, bottlenecks in the production process where one plant could in fact, and this was very evident in the auto sector at certain points, one sector through strike and coordinated activities of workers could cripple entire industries and hold up production of capital in very significant ways. Now, I am not saying that robots, automation, digitalization, gigification, etc., is going to take over all of the work under capitalism. It is not, and those who say that it is, I think, are placing their analytic feet on in something of a house of sand. But to the extent that increasingly new and statistically important work sectors are going to be developed and developing in ecologies of working class isolation and individuation, does mean that the nature of working class struggle and furthering and deepening collectivity is going to be difficult. So I'm more two-sided in some senses, perhaps in my understanding of this and my analysis of this process than Ursula might be, who sees, I think, more openings and possibilities for resistance. But in any case, I think COVID-19, which has really shattered so much of the sort of expectations and conventional wisdoms, it's brought us back to, Keynesianism in ways that we thought were, basically defeated. But it's also, I think, changed capital's understandings of some work sectors and what could be done. So I think at no point in time, and this is really a point I might end on, for much of the struggles of the working class, for the broad reach from the 1850s into the 1950s, where the cry was to organize and sustain a shorter working day. The banner that the mainstream trade unions were marched under was a fair day's work for a fair day's pay. Marx, of course, understood, even in his time in the 1840s and 50s, that this was never enough, and that the banner that the working class needed to march under was the banner, abolish the wage system. That is, resistance to capitalism and a fight against capitalism, which would always take every victory that the working class achieved under its limits, within its boundaries of control. Capital always was going to not necessarily reverse those victories, but in some senses, move them onto different terrains. It has done so recently. And so part of the new ways of living, it strikes me, is again a return to Marx's understanding that the old struggles and their conventional boundaries are not enough. That the new battles must basically up the ante and turn up the heat and begin the process of confronting capitalism and challenging it. Now, the paradox is that after centuries of struggle, a revolutionary left that will actually proclaim the necessity of the abolition of the wage system is probably in a weaker state than it has ever been. The paradox is that as much as I think there is in general, particularly among young people, the embrace of more progressive views on a whole range of issues now than there ever has been historically, around, for instance, struggling against racism, against misogyny, against various typecastings and limitations of sexual orientations, a willingness to acknowledge areas like disability that were never really on the radar screen of the left in the past. Even a sensitivity to working class issues and to working class exploitation and oppression. As much as these are widespread throughout significant swaths of the population, in a way that I think marks today out from the past in important ways. As much as that exists, the paradox is that an organized left that can actually realize the struggle against capitalism, take it to levels necessary in a combative way, that organized left has never been weaker. It's never in the last century has the organized left been as weak as it is right now. And I think that will be the fundamental challenge, to actually reconfigure class relations through a reconfiguration of time, how it is spent, how it is worked, and what it means in the everyday lives of ordinary people. So I think on that note, which I'll leave you on, there should perhaps be challenges and questions and discussions. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Bryan. There's a loud applause, but we can't really hear it over Zoom.
Hi, thank you. Bryan, could you just go over the last couple of things that you said, talking about how time, that in this diffuse new situation where the left has never been weaker, what I missed the last point of what is the restructuring or of time? What is the role of that?
Well, I was really saying that the struggle over time historically has often been understood by much of the mainstream trade union movement, and perhaps in other sectors too. But clearly, the struggle for shorter hours in the labor movement is a central issue. Much of that struggle over time has been conducted under the banner of a fair day's work for a fair day's wage. And Marx, back in the 1840s and after, and into his writings in Capital, basically made the point that as important as these struggles over the legal, putting the legal limitation on the working day were, proceeding under that banner of a fair day's work for a fair day's wage was not enough. And the struggle really needed to be around abolish the wage system. It seemed that there was a certain success and, in that historic struggle, not to abolish the wage system, but for a fair day's work for a fair day's wage, going into the 1960s. In the sense that the 8-hour day seemed to be achieved for many, particularly in the more unionized, sectors. And so in some senses, I think there was a certain complacency about what had been achieved, what had been reached, and everything looked fairly good. The problem was that with the 1970s and a crisis of capital, that all came tumbling down. The trade union movement was assailed. It was weakened. There were neoliberalism went on the attack against the trade unions. More and more of those organized workers were placed in less secure situations, and those who didn't have the protections of trade unionism became more and more the norm. Work became more precarious. Time became more not something that could be won and seized, but something that had to be struggled around to piece together. Instead of one job, people needed three. New sectors of the economy that the Register has been dealing with, the sort of digitalized economy, the gigified economy, et cetera. The whole notion of a legal limit on the working day went out the window. If you talk to young people about the struggle for the 8-hour day, they'll kind of look at you perplexed and say, well, what are you talking about? I have to work 14 hours a day in 2 jobs, or I have to work, this kind of work that doesn't allow me this kind of leeway to even talk about these questions. So the point I'm trying to raise is never before has the struggle to abolish the wage system, it seems to me, been more decisively on the agenda. And yet the very force that will push that agenda and make the rallying cry one of abolish the wage system, the organized left. And here I think there'll be some contention among people. People can may disagree. In my view, the organized left has actually never been weaker, although the basis for its support is probably stronger now, as I said, with in progressive ideas have never been more commonplace among masses of people, I think. So all of the rallying cries that have been associated with the left, including anti-racism and I would say even, women's emancipation, these have become generalized throughout large swaths of the population, much larger than they were by any means in the 1880s or the 1920s or even the 1940s. But what I would say existed in those earlier times was a much stronger organized left. Now it had problems. It was not those organized lefts were not, if you want to call them the old left or even the new left formations of the 60s and 70s. We can see lots to criticize in them. We can see lots of problems. We've learned lots about their inadequacies. But the point is, right now we are so far from having that organized left that the struggle to abolish the wage system seems to me impeded, hampered in ways that it needs to be. We need to rebuild that left so that we can rebuild that capacity to actually argue for and struggle for effectively the abolition of the wage system. Does that, of which the whole question of time and what's done with it will now be will be even more central than it has been in the past, but will need to be rethought anew in terms of the kind of limitations that have now emerged and can now be seen in terms of that old, sort of struggle around time that limited it to, let's make the legal working day the centerpiece of a particular kind of, politics of resistance. Is that?
Yeah, so yes, that's really helpful. So basically just restricting the hours that gig workers should have to work is not going to solve the problem, but changing the wage system.
Exactly. I think that's a very good way of putting it. I mean, do you want to put your energies into, in trying to connect with gigified workers and organize gigified workers?
Absolutely.
I wouldn't say that limiting the hours will necessarily be a total dead end and a single issue that one should simply, I'm not saying it as a single issue, it should be shoved off the table and ignored. But what I am saying is it can't be patched on to that old trade union framework of the shorter hours movement, because the situation is different and the situation in some senses, demands more of us, and demands, that actually, it demands that understanding that Marx had, that these struggles around particularistic issues associated with time may well be central to preserving a measure of working class well-being. But capital has the capacity and will use every option and every new change and every crisis that it itself foments, make that demand, even if it's effective for limiting the hours, limited in terms of its impact. And there will always be new ways in which capital is going to, as long as it's in control, there'll always be new ways in which capital is going to, lessen the impact of that. So the struggle has to be both at the particular level, but with I think, a larger and more, really more audacious set of demands.
Thank you, Bryan. I have Nancy next.
As you explain it, and I think correctly, Marx's view about time and alienation and so on does depend on a view of human nature, one that's not fixed, that's evolving and so forth, but still a view of human nature. And I wonder if you had any thoughts about how the current changes have affected human nature.
That's a small question.
Yeah.
I must say I haven't thought through the specificities of that. I think it has to be altering human nature in some senses. It has to be changing how human beings themselves understand themselves. I think just the current moment in which people have been asked to go back to this forced integration of work and life does suggest to all kinds of people problems with that. I mean, as I pointed out with Thompson, I think an interesting point about Thompson's essay on time and work discipline was that he thought the integration of work and life was a fundamental good. And he could look at that in the context of the 1960s, because looking forward, he actually says this in the essay, we might lose, we might try to change human nature so that we lose that compulsion to look at our watches and see what time it is and see how much time we have. I mean, he wanted a different kind of non-capitalist, if you will, human nature. And he thought the integration of work and life, was a positive good. And in some ways, as a writer, that's the way he worked. He worked very much like, and I know this personally, he worked very much like the old artisanal, kind of the myth of the old artisanal worker, of, an integration of work and life and time for play, bouts of leisure, etc. I think what people have been forced into an integration of work and life with COVID and the sort of working from home, and they see just how difficult it is to blend the children, the waged work or salaried work, the domestic work, and any kind of sort of meaningful life. So I think that it will change understandings of human nature. Beyond saying that, I think that the project has to be more audacious and has to march under the banner of abolition of the wage system. And by that, by extension, the old from each according to their ability, to each according to their needs, has to be part of that. That would fundamentally, it seems to me, alter understandings of human nature. But it's a big project. to sort of liberate oneself from the shackles of acquisitive individualism that, you know, capitalism has essentially contained us within, and that so many forces reproduce on so many levels. Again, I would see this as in sort of rebuilding a left that has a more audacious agenda, addressing those the change of human nature. I don't think this is a great answer to your question, because it's something we need to think about and address, you know, at a personal level, but also at a you know, speak to it, how the personal can actually become collective as well. And that requires a lot of negotiation. And I think we'll actually, you know, a project for the left would be to try to address the way in which individual needs and collective needs can meet, where they can meet, where they can overlap, where there needs to be elasticity around that. It's something the left has not. I mean, feminists have done far more writing on this and work on this, but I still think it needs to be broadened in, you know, significant ways. I'm sorry, it's a fascinating question and a complex and difficult one, and it relates, of course, to how human nature relates to nature.
Yeah.
Which, you know, is another area. There's more being written on it because the imperatives are so, you know, demanding. But it still needs to be, I think, negotiated and addressed in more sophisticated ways.
Thank you. George?
Okay, thank you, Bryan. There's not a single word you said that I don't agree with. I don't disagree with. Everything you said, I do agree with. And I'm sorry. But as far as my question first was, why is the left so weak? And you pretty much answered it in the sense that I look at it as before the question being framed as an honest day's, a fair day's work for a fair day's wage is very different than an honest day's work for an honest day's pay, which is, as a gig worker all my life, pretty much, is how I've looked at it. So in terms of working for the day and being a day laborer and not having this industrial system where I'm 40 hours a week, which I still think is within the public school system, that's antiquated, and I don't think it's that hard. Right now, it's, you know, in terms of that honest day's work, firemen still work 3 days straight in the firehouse. You know, they're 48 hours and they put it in and they go home for 4 days and it's okay. So it's looking at it that way, but for sure, I didn't know what a gig worker was until about 2 months ago. I think it was David who explained it to me, or Bert. But no, that's why my question: why is the left weak? If we're worrying about wages, we don't have to worry about abolishing it. Pretty much, it's more about recognizing what work's being done, and maybe organizing all of these funny things that are coming up on the internet, like I don't want to go into my 3 minutes, but in terms of the one that kills me, as once a cab driver working 12 hours, it's okay. You quit when you want to and go home. But now they're trying to tack on tips for the new organizing the drivers. We had the Teamsters, we had unions, and whatever. I said enough, except for I agree with you totally, and I really appreciate the work you're doing. And before I forgot, it has more. I have to get back to teachers. It's the intensification of labor, because you're absolutely correct. How they'll figure out another way to just make you spend all of this time for nothing. So thank you very much for a beautiful talk, and I better mute and shut up. Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you. Can I just ask you what your work is that you say you've been a? What's the work that you're doing?
My best job was 10 years as a bartender, 12-hour shifts, an honest day's work and for an honest day's pay. And after that, as a taxi driver, I hated it, but as a chauffeur too. And then finally as a teacher. I've had 3 trades. And the worst has been teacher, and just because of that wage system that, well, we'll talk about unions another day. Contract unions versus guilds and crafts. But thank you.
Thank you.
I have Peter next with a question.
Yeah, Bryan, in the 1980s, late 80s, I did a study of Argentine workers, and I found Andre Gorz very interesting. And I wondered if you could say more how Gorz has influenced your view of the working class, how he's, you know, given you insights that you might not have had before.
Well, I think Gorz wrote some very interesting things. Whether they had much of an impact on me, not so much. I think the book that I actually go after a bit in a critical way in this essay is the book Farewell to the Working Class, which in some senses, I mean, you could look at the essay and it says it better there than I'll be able to, you know, spin off the top of my head. But Gorz, like a lot of people, thought that basically the working class and its struggles in this book, Farewell to the Working Class, had basically come to, you know, it was gone as that agent of social change that so many, you know, that most Marxists would have embraced and understood as the, you know, the reason they gravitated towards studying the working class, working within the working class, orienting to the working class. And I think in that book, he was part of that sort of, in some senses, buoyant optimism that there were totally new possibilities that could be, you know, that had been thrown open, you know, from the 60s on. And I think that a lot of his sensibilities, which is that automation and robotization, were going to change fundamentally the class relations of modern society. They haven't actually been borne out. The notion that the working day was going to basically be reduced more and more and more, which was common, as I said, from Keynes in 1930 on. And what we've seen instead is that the working day has been extended. And perhaps I could turn the question around, since you probably have studied Gorz more than I have. What did you think was his main contribution?
You know, I spent the afternoon looking for my Gorz copy and I couldn't find it. So I was trying to recapitulate how I found him useful. But what I do recall was that he understood the workers as more than workers, that they were human beings, they were into computers, into leisure, into all kinds of other aspects that made them human beings, sort of like Marxist economic philosophical manuscripts or like Erich Fromm. So I found it useful that the worker is a lot more complicated than a 9-to-5 worker, and that people have to see them as a greater entity. That's remember, but I was looking for my book and I couldn't find it.
Was it Farewell to the Working Class that you were looking for?
Yes.
Yeah.
See, I found the Argentine workers militant without being revolutionaries, because I think he gave me an insight of how they could be angry and pissed off and pushing without having a utopian notion of what the future is going to look like.
Yeah. I do recall in that book as well, though. I think you're right that he saw class formation as more multidimensional than many who had basically reduced it down to, you know, the wage and the job. But what I found in looking at it for writing this essay, there were some incredibly condescending things about, for instance, the power public sector workers. Now, a part of this, I'm sure, was he was writing out of, confronting the bureaucracy of the French system, where sometimes it can get pretty oppressive, right? But he saw certain powers in public sector unionism. I could quote you them if go to the book, but you'll find them when you find your copy, which I found, how should I put it, not only disparaging of workers, but also pretty narrow in their understanding of, his own maybe personal confrontations with a bureaucratic setting. Often these would be, I suspect, white collar workers in government service, and him confronting, that system. But I think the main point for me was that in bidding farewell to the working class and buying into the fact that the struggles of the organized working class had attained as much of a level as it was possible for progressive politics, and it was time to move beyond that. I thought it left too much unanswered on the table, and I think the trajectory of times subsequent has actually not been in the direction that he, imagined and anticipated. But I may be being too disparaging and limited. Someone like Greg Albel might be able to answer this question better than I.
Greg is on stack after Herb, so I'm sure he'll get to it. Herb?
Okay.
So I read your article from the Socialist Register this afternoon, and it resonated a great deal because I spent a while in the early mid-70s agitating for a 30-hour work week for 40 hours pay. And I thought that the international movement was moving for a shorter work week in France and in Germany, and that all seemed to have been pushed back. Would you say these issues are international, the issues you're raising about time? Does it just apply to the first world, or is it a worldwide phenomenon? And last thing I wanted to ask about was, so what you're essentially saying is that we need to fight for communism. Is that what I'm hearing? Because that's what the abolition of the wage system is essentially the demand for.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the struggle, it seems to me that, I am arguing that what the struggle should be for revolutionary socialism. Yes. Yeah. The question about, is this internationalism, I think, is a very good question. And it strikes me that when one moves off of the plane of the advanced capitalist political economies, and one looks to, capitalism and its globalization, you do see situations in the developing world which are fundamentally different, and time will be looked on fundamentally differently in economies like Brazil or India, parts of Africa, parts of Latin America and Asia, etc., or even in political economies like that of current Russia. And the notion, the push for instance, which was a push and one in which I would have supported, of 30 for 40 in the advanced capitalist economies. If you were to raise that, in Uruguay or China, I mean, it's on such a different level. And also, there's a necessity to understand that, precarious work, which has increasingly become the norm in the advanced capitalist economies, has always been absolutely the norm in the developing world. And so there, the notion of restricting, putting a legal limit on the working day probably seems rather otherworldly, to people eking out a living on the fringes of a waged economy, in the most marginalized and exploited and oppressed sectors of, places in like Nairobi or whatever. I think Mike Davis's book on the Planet of Slums is illuminating on that, right? If you read that book and place it against the kind of struggles you're talking about, where 30 or 40 is a demand and a legitimate one, then you understand that there's going to be different levels at which the class struggle has to operate. Again, what I would say is, if you are fighting those struggles under the banner abolish the wage system, you're more likely to be able to look at the totality of differentiation around time and come up with reasonable and forceful ways of addressing time in the very different situations that people confronted. But that's always an important level, and I mean, I was struck by that issue of the advanced capitalist economies and their relationship to class relations and work. And when you look at those economies and you contrast them to a more global understanding of capitalism, then the whole question of precarious work takes on a totally different meaning. I mean, the notion that precarious work is somehow new. If you look at Africa, Asia, Latin America, I mean, no. I mean, actually, you look at the advanced economies, it's not new either. Proletarianization and semi-proletarianization and casualization of labor. This has always entailed precariousness. But how one struggles over the question of time and its appropriation within those different political economies, that's something that actually needs to be addressed and addressed in ways that appreciate those differences.
Thank you, Greg.
Yeah, you just finished off, which I was first going to ask you to draw some linkage with your earlier essay on precarity, Bryan. So that was my first thing, how you kind of conceived this essay in relationship to some of the themes from your essay on precarity. You kind of started touching on it. And your opening was actually the intent, Leo, I had on the essay, was for you to put some perspective through the history of capitalism and the changes over struggle of time, for the way that the struggle over time is now being configured under digital capitalism. I might have put a little bit more emphasis than you did in your presentation on work polarization or time polarization, with some people not being able to get enough work time and some getting too much work time. And I think that's particularly blurs then what I think was one of the great themes of your essay, which is the blurring between paid work time and non-work time, the way that the kind of digital capitalism and platform capitalism makes some of these things so blurred that notions of trying to separate the two have kind of fallen apart. And they've fallen apart for those struggling to get enough work time, but particularly have struggled with those, fallen apart for those getting too much work in the sense particularly. And so you have kind of an interesting kind of dichotomy over those things, which I think are really a critical aspect of tying together the way different struggles over work time are occurring under the dominance of platform capitalism. I was wondering also if you could, if when you're starting to, one of the themes that you're kind of raising about digital capitalism and time is particularly the way in labor process it's start being a struggle over almost nanoseconds and the surveillance over nanoseconds, et cetera, et cetera. I'm wondering if you're also thinking of this in terms of the way Taylorism and that control over work and time actually extends to the non-work time too, and the way that that much of the essay is blurring those two things. Whether you are also thinking of the way that those kinds of Taylorist things are structuring our daily life, the way that capitalism has penetrated those things. And why I think that's important is of how far you wanted to push this. Is it's the theme of Gorz that he starts with in the end of the working class, farewell to the working classes, is of course he extends it even further in the Critique of Economic Reason, where he goes and reverts any notion that he had earlier that work could be a place of liberation and work is now only a place of drudgery and we have to accept it. And then, as you were saying, he expects to push mainly to keep dropping work hours down to whatever, 15 hours a week or something, as Keynes, et cetera. But that's where he says, the sphere of necessity and everything would be a realm of freedom, which to some extent is, the same theme that you get a lot of from anarchist movements today, where you're trying to put barricades around capitalism and work and finding free time or cooperative structures outside capitalist paid work. And it seems to me a critical theme that you're raising that complements so much of the themes that people have been making about the way that financialization and that continual monetary calculation enters everyday life. Your notion that if you keep pushing what you're arguing, it's also the brittleness of thinking there can be a separation from work time, paid work time, and non-work time under these conditions, because what's occurring is a breakdown of all those standards, so that those kinds of notions are completely our strategies have fallen apart at this moment. And as you've been putting it, we have to really think overall our strategy to time as a whole. I'm just wondering how far you want to keep pushing that theme as both a theoretical and empirical point of departure of what you're analyzing, as well as a strategic necessity for the left today.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to answer all of that, but as I was listening to you, which is a fascinating comment, it did strike me that, like Larry Lohmann's article, I kind of start from the premise that often what is new is very old. Often we've been through in one form what very new paraded forms seem to be developing. So that, a lot of the work that is now, done out of people's, bedrooms through, digitalization and various platforms, et cetera, is akin on one level to the putting out system of, the early 19th century. It has some resonance with piecework, in the sense that people are paid, by, with very distinct, productive outputs that are measured. But it's like Taylorism on steroids where we're at now. I mean, just the surveillance, the measuring of the pieces of the commodity, that in some of these, I don't even know that much about a lot of this digitalized work, but you're paid fractions of pennies for pieces of information that are then fed to these, to Amazon or whatever. So I think the task is to understand the dialectic, if you will, between how this is old and how it is new. Because in appreciating how it's old and how we have seen comparable developments in the past, but they've quantitatively or even sometimes qualitatively, they've shifted gears in the present. We can make linkages between, you know, how class struggles were fought out then, what was learned from that, and how they might be applied to the present. As to how much I want to push the blurrings of this, I'm struck by the ways in which new forms of capitalist work do throw us back to age-old questions of, you know, how to organize and how to organize in workplace ecologies that in fact are not necessarily conducive to the advances of, you know, workers that we've seen in the past. So it does require shifting gears and approaching things in new ways, but it's the intensification of the processes of work discipline that I think, and the atomization of the experience of work under them, that are the key challenges. But I come back to, again, the weakness of the organized left in the current moment. Because if unions in the traditional sense are going to face more and more problems dealing with some of these new forms of work organization and new intensifications of exploitation and new levels of oppression that follow on that, in terms of just, for instance, the surveillance of workers on a 24-hour basis, right? That it is more and more imperative for there be a left to be there, that workers in these situations can gravitate to, and for that left to speak to the particular experiences of people in these settings. And I think it's that will actually allow even union organization to take place. It's not unlike, in some senses, the fact that many of the workers that, for instance, the Wobblies organized were in more atomized, more individualistic, more hard to organize work settings than the factory system that the AFL unions actually, penetrated more, effectively, somewhat effectively. They organized Bindlestiffs and, migratory workers, and they did it by being a left, by being a union that in some senses wasn't a union. And so I'd like to think that those kinds of initiatives, which are part of rebuilding the left, might well provide, possibilities for workers who see themselves in some senses as outside of, the union jurisdictions. And of course, rebuilding that left means challenging the mainstream unions, which have pretty much, in some senses, like the old craft unions, have abandoned lots of workers, right? And seem at this point not to be, struggling to, organize the unorganized. Not a great answer to your question, but you had a lot to make me chew on there.
Thank you. Kate?
Hi, I just posted my question, which essentially is, I'm sorry, I'm kind of moving away from this extraordinary continuity of discussion, but I'm curious as to how you perceive the impact that our focus on identity politics has had on being able to address the issues that we're focusing on this evening, particularly work quantity, volume, time, and all the elements, those class elements, as opposed to the several identity politics elements that seem to preoccupy so much of the ether these days?
Well, that's a fundamental question, and one I'm sure that's on all kinds of people's minds. I did say, and I do believe that this, and it ties into your point, is that the paradox right now is that, well, I don't think we've ever seen a situation in countries like Canada and the United States where generalized opposition to bigotries, prejudices, systematic oppressions is more widespread throughout the general population, particularly young people. So that, when you refer to identity politics, these are the politics that many younger people embrace. And the explosive demonstrations around Black Lives Matter in this past summer were a reflection of that. On one level, this is a matter of, I would say, this is a positive development, a matter for rejoicing on the left. It's not to say, however, that there's not a backlash too, and that there isn't a right-wing, response to this. I mean, we've seen that very clearly. But that right wing that sort of has been galvanized in some senses by Trump and legitimized by Trump. That has always existed, for instance, in the American political culture. It's always been there. They've been a bit more brazen and a bit more open and a bit more tied to a series of other developments around, rights and freedoms and entitlements. So there is an upside to the sort of generalized support for the politics of identity. The problem, it seems to me, is that is that when it gets posed against more universalistic demands for struggles, and when it gets posed against what some on the identitarian left quite openly refer to as class reductionism. I do think that the lack of an organized left, as I'm referring to it, is a consequence of, in some senses, the particularities of attachment to particular social movements and particular struggles against the oppressions of various groups. And I don't mean to be condescending, and I don't mean to dismiss the importance of those particularities, because the left will have to address those if it's going to move forward. But one would like to see a left that could actually bridge the gaps between and differentiations among these identitarian attachments. And to the extent that class cuts through all of these, it still seems to me that it has a mobilizing capacity at the universalistic level that is actually quite important. And a left that cannot bridge some of these differences and be sensitive to them and address class is simply going to founder and not be the success that I think it needs to be. Does that come at your question at all?
So sorry, I'm having some technological. Yes, that was helpful, and particularly this idea that that we must learn how to bridge the issues that are being raised, especially given how youth are concerned about them, but then also that the left must make certain, I assume you're saying, to be addressing the more universal issues of class, or how class permeates all these other issues. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's a very good question, and I mean it's everywhere right now, and I think the the politics of identity, as you put it, have in some senses been mainstreamed. So, for instance, when Nancy Pelosi says that the assault on the Capitol building was one in which the Trump protesters traded their whiteness and their privileged whiteness for democracy, she's really feeding into the notion that was quite common on the broadcast, mainstream broadcast of the liberal media, that this was really that the protesters were treated differently because they were white. There's no denying that. There's no denying that a Black Lives Matter protest would have been handled very, very, very differently by the police. Now, this is not putting it on the plane of what the left must do, but it's how things are getting analyzed in our time. I see the mix that allowed the police to simply, at times, not always, but at times, wink and nod at that crowd and let them through and into the building, into the Capitol. I see that as a fusion of the politics of whiteness with the politics of a lot of other things, including a class politics, not necessarily, I'm not referring to a working class politics. There's a need to actually, it seems to me, to parse things a little more carefully, rather than always boil it down to what is seemingly the most obvious and egregious issue. And while I've used the example of a right-wing protest to that, we could extend that, I believe, to the struggles of the left in our time as well.
I have myself on stack, followed by Nithya and Michael. So I agree with you that the left is weak. Yet, what is funny is that the DSA, the largest socialist organization in America, believes the exact opposite, that the left has never been stronger, right? This strength is seen in the developing so-called socialist consciousness amongst Americans brought about by the campaigns of Bernie Sanders, AOC, and other progressive politicians, right? And the conclusion is, of course, that we must put all our efforts behind such campaigns and do not risk, and this is for them is very important, do not risk alienating this delicate consciousness that is developing by any radical Marxist claims, right? As a consequence, any basic Marxist demand, such as abolishing the wage system, is attacked harshly. And if you look at their most recent publication, labeled as irrelevant Leninist or Trotskyist demands, right? So the question for me, like as someone that is involved in the DSA, what is to the left of DSA, is how do we navigate these waters, right? And how should we think about the existing level of consciousness and its relation to radical demands? Because one could possibly argue, it seems to me, that the problem is not that our demands are too radical, but that they're not radical enough, right? Maybe today, a demand such as abolish the state would be much more popular with people than, let's vote for Bernie. I don't know, but I just wonder, how do we think about this?
Well, the first thing I'll say is that, I don't have any, I have no crystal ball and I have no absolute answers. I've put out, a position that I would defend. I find it, I think, I find what you're saying about the DSA to be absolutely right. I mean, I find that troubling. But here's the point: as the left has imploded, as this demise of the left that I've talked about has happened, the DSA has grown. because as left groups have fractured, splintered, imploded, some of them, like the ISO, have gone into the DSA. Left groups have always, small left Marxist groups have always actually had relationships with larger mass parties. Generally, their relationship has been with mass parties of the left that were, for one reason or another, insufficient in the eyes of, Marxists, but contained members who were moving to the left or were themselves occupying contradictory centrist ground that could be pushed in different directions. It seems to me that the Democratic Party, I mean, I don't want to sound sectarian, the Democratic Party has basically contained, if not suffocated and defeated, every left initiative that it has ever encountered. And if people go into the Democratic Party to and work in the DSA and claim that they are not going to put forward radical demands because these will somehow simply dissipate the progressive consciousness that they see as growing, then it seems to me inevitably the only reason to be in the Democratic Party, that is to move its ranks to the left, is you've thrown in the towel on that project already. Now, for me personally, I would never be in the DSA. But if you are there and you do consider yourself on the left, then why not push for a politics that is fundamentally to the left, rather than, go along with the mainstream of the Democratic Party, where, what you're going to get is Joe Biden. And what Joe Biden is going to do is basically clamp down on any left-wing initiative. Now, in some ways, all of this was overdetermined by Trump, and I understand that. That people in the United States on the left said we cannot have 4 more years of Donald Trump. So they ended up in the Democratic Party basically going to Biden, when anybody in the DSA would have to have seen that, as soon as Bernie seemed to have a shot, they just moved to cut him off at the knees, and their best vehicle was Biden. He was a tried and true. I mean, he looked like he was done, and there was nowhere for him to go in the beginning of that, the primaries for the presidential nomination. I was amazed that they didn't promote right off the bat Kamala Harris, but she has come in as the VP, and she is there as his kind of second in command now. But she was the mainstream candidate that actually resonated with much of what Kate's talked about in terms of the politics of identity. I mean, I'd be interested in hearing your response to this. I just do not see the validity of being in the DSA and stifling left-wing politics and left-wing and left-wing perspectives and issues, when the only reason to be there is to try to recruit more and more people to left-wing politics, rather than have them watch the unfolding of left-wing politics into a mainstream Democratic Party.
Right. That is precisely it's precisely the relation to the DSA that we have to think, we are trying to understand, because a lot of people that are radicalized, DSA is where they go. And we have to think how we relate to these newly radicalized people that don't necessarily know much about Marxist theory, history, and all of that. And that's the main reason that quite a lot of us are in DSA. But they also do stifle any discussion that goes to the left of what they want, almost explicitly by trying to get rid of people through bureaucratic mechanisms. So it's an amazing.
I mean, if the DSA has done an entry into the Democratic Party, but there must be left caucuses inside the DSA, right? There must be left currents. It strikes me that, if you're going to be in it, then the obligation is to actually organize, if the DSA is organizing this, the left in the Democratic Party, then somebody needs to be, and I'm sure there is. I mean, I know there is, in fact, but it strikes me that would be the only option. It's looking at it from outside the country and outside of DSA. It's astonishing to me as a leftist that, the Democratic Party, it is such a travesty in terms of any kind of progressive politics. I mean, and it was so transparent what they did with Sanders. The way in which it looked like he was, it looked like he was on a roll, and then bang, down it came, and they shut him down, and it was over. In a second, it was over. I think the more that the shutting down of left-wing positions, within the DSA is brought out into the open and the public, the better it is. And I've seen some instances of that in terms of even AOC and what she's been doing around various issues. And I think that's to the good, because the young people that are gravitating, as you say, that are looking for answers and are trying to get educated, that's part of the process. It's just something that generations have to go through. It strikes me that fundamental to the creation of the kind of left that I'm saying needs to be rebuilt is a politics that will actually operate on really what was the maxim of the 19th century and early 20th century labor movement, which was that an injury to one is an injury to all. So you talked about worker centers, and when people aren't working, they're doing various things. It strikes me then that what you're trying to do in rebuilding a left is to rebuild a left that will actually connect the unconnectable, which will actually cultivate notions not of the Sam Gompers old craft union, we reward our friends, we punish our enemies, we simply want more and more in the wage package for our members and our dues paying members. Instead, you build a left which can actually intersect with the unions to get them out of the spaces of what Lenin would have called the narrowness of the trade union consciousness, making unions into those vehicles of that yes, address defensively the needs of the working class and of their members, but also speak to wider and wider vistas of possibility that connect up with a left that's outside the unions that actually has that agenda as well. We are so far from that right now, so far from that. I mean, and it's not just the trade unions' fault, because the trade unions have actually faced a massive assault over the course of the last 4.5 decades, and they've been driven in on themselves. But that has had the effect of producing working class leaders who really pale in comparison before even the trade union consciousness leaders of the 30s and 40s, who at their best and even at their worst seem to me to understand far more the necessity of speaking to wider issues. But again, they were pressured by an organized left outside of them. to do that. And there's no organized left outside of the trade unions that's actually effectively pressuring them at this point in time. Not in Canada, not in the States much either.
So we are at time, but Bryan, if you can stay a few minutes longer, I still have Michael on stack. And I myself have to go meet a student, but Michael will be moderating the last few minutes.
Okay, I'm glad to stay around for a few more minutes.
Thank you.
Bryan, this was a great talk. I did want you to speak a bit on the difference between UAW and CAW. We had the UAW in Detroit that did need to get straightened out by the Revolutionary Union movement. But then that Revolutionary Union movement, like all the American left, fractionalized and fought with each other as well. There are people in that movement that don't speak to each other anymore, even though they were co-leaders or co-organizers. We cannibalize ourselves on the American left all the time. I don't know if the same happens across the river, across the lakes, but I assume that some of that is a North American problem in these huge expanses where we don't really get the class consciousness of seeing each other working all the time. I'm turning my co-hosting over to Fred, who is one of the organizers of the MEP, because I have to go and see a car accident. And thank you everyone for coming. This was a great talk. And Greg, thanks for coming. And I trust I'll see many of you on Sunday for Larry's talk.
Thanks again. Good luck. I hope everybody's okay.
Thanks,
Yes,
Michael. Hope all's well.
hope that goes well. And,
Yeah. Hope all's well, Michael.
We'll be okay. Thank you again, Bryan.
Thanks.
Okay, so again, we are pretty much at time here. If Bryan, I don't know whether you wanted to respond for a moment just to Michael's question about the various auto workers unions in North America, and then I think we should bring it to a close.
Yeah, I won't get into the CAW, UAW, because I think there's other people who know far more about it than I do. But what I would say to Michael is that the fragmentation of the left is not a peculiarly American or indeed Canadian problem. It's a universal global problem, and it has happened everywhere. And it is a tragedy. It's part of the internal fragmentation is part of what I was referring to vis-a-vis the lack of an organized left at the current moment. But it's not just internal, and a lot of that internal fragmentation was, of course, not separable from the state and its the quintuple type, interventions and the disinformation and the presence of provocateurs, and that's happened everywhere. Our comrade in Toronto, Ernie Tate, just died a week or 10 days ago, and he was one of his last political acts was to testify before a hearing in Britain that's been exploring the role of undercover police, really despicable things that they did in Britain in the left mobilizations of the 1960s. Really outrageous things. I mean, things of people going undercover, establishing relationships, actually marrying and having children with women or men on the left, and at all the time being an agent and an informant and disrupting, and we've seen that over and over again, and that's been a part of the fragmentation on the left. Not its only reason, but it has been a part.
Okay, once again, Bryan, thank you very much for your talk. Greg, thank you again for helping MEP to organize these events, and we look forward to seeing everyone at the next opportunity.
Yeah, thank you very much to everybody.
Thank you. It was a
Thanks
great,
so much. It was a great evening.
Thank you.
it was a great evening. Yes.
Thank
I
you.
learned a lot.
Super interesting.
Good night.
Night, everybody. Bye-bye.
Night.
Good night.